So I'm Daniel Pardy and I'm a freelance colourist from Australia. When I first entered the film industry, I actually thought I wanted to be an editor. And one of my first jobs was at this little production house in regional Australia, and I was there cutting away. But because of the size of the company, the role actually encompassed a number of other responsibilities such as motion graphics and a bit of sound mixing, which was fantastic because it gave me an opportunity to see how all facets of a film came together. But I was always a bit frustrated that the final look of a lot of the local commercials we were doing, it lacked a certain polish. And so I started to play around with the grading tools just in the edit systems that we were using, and that kind of gave me that initial taste for grading. And then as my skills developed there, I started to use more dedicated grading applications, and eventually I wrapped up at that company and started working in Sydney. And in Sydney I discovered that colour grading actually was its own specialty. It wasn't just something that the editor also did. And upon discovering that, I was just like, oh, well, I much prefer grading over cutting, so I'm just going to go and do that one instead, I think. So I was brought on quite early in the piece for the film, which was fantastic because it gave me the opportunity to kind of oversee the whole post pipeline before principal had even begun. And so we had very early meetings with Parrish, the director, where he explained his ideas that he had for the final aesthetic of the film, along with a lot of references that he brought up, which was great for me to be able to start visualizing how it was ultimately going to look. And he was very influenced by sort of these European and American films from the 70s, and that influence was just in the DNA of the script from the get-go. And during the pre-production phases, we did a number of camera tests with the cinematographers, Sue and Alexi, and we looked at a variety of different lenses as well as pro mist filters because we wanted to create a very sort of dreamlike aesthetic with the film. And so we shot all those, brought that in and played around with those in Baselight. And one of the big things was seeing how far we could push the pro mist using the diffuser tools. And I think the end result we got was, I think it fit exactly what we were after there. So another really important part of this particular grade is that the look of the film is tied to Hans's psychological state. And so at the beginning of the film, it's very drained. And as it progresses, Hans starts to embrace his delusions and his psychosis. And along with that, the colours start to become more saturated and more vivid, and the highlights start to bloom and have this very sort of softened aesthetic to them. And as we go on and on, this becomes more and more intense. And what we actually do is we separated out the film in different stages and set specific levels for what stage of his psychosis he was at. And I think one of the things that was interesting in embracing the vividness, we're watching this character commit acts that are becoming increasingly questionable and immoral, and yet we've got this look that is very vivid and very joyous to a point, which is reflective of the fact that he's enjoying his delusions. And I think that helps for the audience in this awkward position where they're seeing something that visually should be inspiring happiness in them, but the actions are so counter to exactly that. To kick us off, I thought it'd be important to quickly go over the colour journey of this project in Baselight. There's a great deal of ease and flexibility with these tools, which makes life considerably easier when you need to deliver in multiple colour spaces. So if we look at the colour space journey, we can see on this particular shot we're starting in Sony Linear and S-Gamut 3, and that's been converted to our working colour space of ACES CCT with AP1 primaries. That's then converted using the ACES RRT, which gets us into our display colour space, or our viewing colour space of Rec 709. It's important to note also that all the grade operators are actually being done in the working colour space, not the viewing color space. And this is what enables us to then change the viewing color space depending on what our deliverable requirements are, such as P3 for cinema or Rec. 709 for home video and broadcast. This way our grade is kept intact regardless of the deliverables color space. However, despite the great flexibility of being able to change the viewing color space without needing to redo the entire grade, there are instances where we might want to alter the grade for a particular color space. Fortunately, FilmLight provides a way to have a grade and effect operators only apply when we actually need them to. For this film, Bloodshot Heart, we needed the colours to become increasingly intense and saturated as the story progressed. Depending on the lighting, this would create some problems with colours being pushed so hard that they would clip, having fallen out of the display space's gamut. To remedy this, we have FilmLight's compressed gamut operator, which allows us to bring clip colours back into the chosen gamut. So I will just insert one of those onto this shot. We can then select the gamut which we wish to compress for. So in this instance, because our display space is set to Rec. 709, that's what I'll do here. And then the chroma threshold, that determines how intense the effect of the gamut compression is. 0.1 is a very typical setting, but experiment according to what your particular shot needs. And so if we toggle that off and on, it's no longer clipping. However, we do have a problem in that what we've now done though is we've restricted the colours in this shot to the Rec. 709 gamut, and for this film I also need to do a P3 deliverable for cinema. We've lost those extra colours available in the P3 gamut as a result of this compression. However, we can't just simply remove the compressed gamut because we'll still have clipping problems in P3. And so to fix this, what we'll do is we'll actually duplicate this compressed gamut layer, and we'll change our gamut from Rec. 709 to P3. And I'm also just going to rename the layers so I know which one's which. Even though we've got both of these on, what it does actually mean, however, is they're actually both in effect at the same time. If you look at the vector scope over here while I toggle that off and on, which you obviously don't want. We only want the relevant one to be activated when we're in the appropriate color space. We could just simply bypass these manually, but if we're working in a film that has a number of shots that we have a color space specific correction on, that's going to get very tedious, particularly when it comes to time for deliverables and such. So to get around that, what we're actually going to do is we're going to add some categories. So I've got some custom categories already for Rec. 709 and P3, so let's add one for Rec. 709 on that, and P3 on this one here. So with our categories set, over in our cursor window we're going to add the bypass categories option. And seeing as we're already in Rec. 709, what we'll do is we'll bypass our P3 categories. And so that's added a little blue bypass marker for us, so we know that it's being bypassed by the cursors rather than it's a manual bypass. And if we had multiple shots in this sequence, so I'll just duplicate this as an example, that's all bypassed for anything with that P3 category. And so if we then need to switch to the P3 space because we're working on that, we can simply change over to P3 and swap our category bypass as we need to. Another thing also, if the system that you're using is normally viewing only the one color space, like maybe it's a Rec. 709 only monitor or it's a projector set up specifically for P3, you might also simply be just focused on one particular color space pass at this stage in the project. And so in the cogwheel menu under the cursors, you can tell it to default so that whenever this scene is opened, it's going to already have these bypass categories enabled as you need them. Another thing also, don't forget that when it does come time to render, make sure the bypass category options are set properly in the render window. That way your grade will actually export correctly for the chosen color space. So I've had the opportunity to work on a wide variety of projects, but I think one of the ones that probably holds personal significance for me has been the film restorations that I've done for the National Film and Sound Archive over at Vandal in Sydney. The thing that's so interesting with these particular projects is that you're looking at almost like relics of cinematic history, and you're able to contribute to help bringing that back to life, which is an incredible responsibility, but also a great privilege. And like one of the things that I think particularly was appealing to me, and I saw this particularly on Black Robe when we were restoring that, was the opportunity to work closely with the original directors, original cinematographers, because for Black Robe specifically, Peter James, the DP, he was very heavily involved with that restoration, which was fantastic to be able to work alongside him. As part of Bloodshot Hearts look, we wanted to introduce some chromatic aberration to emulate some of the problems of lenses used in the 70s. To do this, the first thing we'll do is we'll create a new layer at the bottom of our stack, and then we'll add a nice vignette. And then in the outside layers, we're going to change one of the operators over to shader, which is the matchbox shaders. And we're going to select chroma warp. You'll already notice that that's already done an effect on the areas outside of the vignette. And we can select that parameter and we can adjust this to however we need for the intensity of that. So I set it to around these for this particular film, which is just very sort of slight and subtle. I also wanted to add a bit of diffusion to the edges, just help emulate the softness of those old lenses, and so we'll add another, well, we'll change another operator, this time to diffuse. So we'll bring these settings up, and then we'll mix it in, probably about that much there. So you can see how it's just giving that sort of soft edge around, and then for a final touch I might just drop the light by about half a stop, I'd say. And so that gives us our final vignette look. With a just touch of chromatic aberration. Often I will work with a grade layer that represents the creative looks of a scene. From shot to shot, this layer will remain unchanged, with the balancing done in other layers. So if the look is for just a single scene, then I can simply copy the layer and select the bottom of my other shots in the scene and do a smart paste. So it's very sort of relatively quick. Let's just pretend that that's the, about here, we'll pretend that that's the entirety of that scene, and then we'll just insert that like that. And now that correction is across all these different shots. However, I may find myself working on a project that requires a particular effect to be applied to the majority, if not all the shots. If it's a 30-second commercial, it's fairly quick to just select the shots as before and insert the layer. For a feature film, however, that could be a bit more fiddly, especially when the timeline starts to get quite long and you can't necessarily see all the stacks in as much detail. Using this 70s vignette that we created before, we'll use this. I'm just going to do some initial organization. So give it a distinct name so that we can identify it. And I'm going to change the layer number to 200, just arbitrarily high number. The reason for that is I want this to be at the bottom of the stack, and so with the different layer controls, they should default to higher numbers, and this will remain at the bottom of the grade. And I'll also just assign it a category to make it a bit easier to select as I need to. And so that way, if I once this is across multiple shots, if I decide, oh, I need to actually select all of them because there's an issue that I need to change or whatnot, just under the selects window, I can select by category, and that will select all strips with that category. I've chosen to put this effect on a shot that's very early on. It's the first time that this effect will actually occur in the film. It was a very deliberate decision to make life a bit easier for this next stage. So what we're going to do is we'll select those layers and copy them, and then we'll move to the next shot. Under the select menu, we'll choose select stack bottoms right, and so that will select the strip that's at the bottom of every stack to the right. You'll notice that on the left side of things nothing was applied, and then we're just going to do another smart paste. And now that effect has been applied to every shot in the film from that point onwards. We may need to remove the correction from certain shots for creative or technical reasons. However, in terms of efficiency, it's far faster to apply the effect to 1,000 shots that need it and then remove it from a handful rather than the other way around. One of the things that really fascinates me with color grading as it compared to a lot of other jobs is you're able to combine disciplines of artistic creativity with technical skill and collaboration. And I think a lot of other jobs out there, you often can only combine one or two of those. You very rarely get to see all three put together. And so on one hand, I can be exploring and expressing my own artistic sensibilities while just completely nerding out on the technical and the scientific side of grading. But then in addition to that, you know, as you're in the room with the director and the cinematographer, and you've all got your own perspectives on the image, and together you're able to see things that the other can't, and ultimately you wind up with a result that is far stronger than if it was just one of you developing it.